Hi, my name is Evelyn.
Hi, my name is Esther.
And I'm Hilda.
And I'm Alice.
And we are at the forefront.
We are a global movement of Black women committed to social justice and gender equality.
Our mission is to elevate the voices of Black women and promote representation of Black women in leadership.
We also aim to drive programs that help us to address the unique challenges that our communities experience.
And to give voice and co-create safe spaces to heal divides that affect Black women globally.
So as I was saying, my name is Evelyn, and I am a Sierra Leonean Gambian American, born in Freetown, Sierra Leone. I grew up all over the world, in Addis, Ethiopia, Lusaka, Zambia, but I spent many of my years living in New York and Washington, D.C. I am now based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I moved here with my 7-year-old son. And we live a very exciting life here in Kenya. I work for a research company, but my background is in international development, and I've worked a long time in gender equity, M&E, program management, and multi-sectoral international development.
And I'm a Kenyan, Esther, as I mentioned. I'm a feminist, I'm a sexual and reproductive health rights activist, and a psychologist in the background. I have a 3-year-old who is amazing, and I think it's also important to note that I started a small organization that is called Zamara Foundation that works towards ending child marriage and really interlinkages between child marriages and sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we work to also challenge the status quo. So I'm so happy to be with the advocate.
I'm also born in Kenya, but I've lived in the UK for about 8 years. I'm now living in Nairobi, so I consider myself a returnee. So I'm a researcher by profession. I have worked on research on a number of countries, including South Asia, the UK, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I have a passion to really apply my research background to the forefront movement to really address the unique challenges that Black women across the Africa diaspora face.
Alice again. I am from Zambia, born in Zambia. I've spent 20 plus years in the US and then I guess technically returned to Zambia over 12 years ago. Now based in Nairobi, Kenya with my family. And for me, having had experiences with Black women in Zambia before leaving, as a returnee in the US, there's been lots of great things, but there's also been lots of challenges within those spaces. And so for me, having the opportunity to be able to share spaces and conversation with Black women and tackle difficult conversations, that whether it's experiences we are all facing, as well as our own experiences with each other, is very important to me. And that's what I really like about At the Forefront.
So we are a movement that is very much devoted to Pan-Africanism, inclusion, intersectionality, looking at our walks of life, particularly as Black women and being women, and what our race and our ethnicity and our national identity, how that factors into the type of bias and discrimination that we face day in and out in our lives. And this year, we thought it'd be really interesting to have a series of critical conversations that address some hot topics that many people are not really willing to address or don't want to address as particularly educated people that are professionals that are working particularly in international development and in the nonprofit space. So today we're going to be talking about this term called crabs in a barrel, which I live here in Nairobi and I spend a lot of time with Kenyans and with women talking about gender equality. And this is a term that I came to find out is very American. And so it was very interesting introducing it here in Kenya and gathering perspectives and seeing if it actually works to your local context. So this whole idea of crabs in a barrel means that there are limited resources. And when a certain group is faced with limited resources, they tend to instead of lift each other up to bring the overall community up, they're actually dragging each other down. Because they realize that there are limited spaces and limited resources. And so we're really thinking about, in this case, in the professional space. And I thought there was a really interesting article that was published by Nadia Owusu, who's a longtime columnist for the New York Times, and she has her own column. And it was about how hiring a chief diversity inclusion officer does not solve your race issue in the corporate space. And so I shared that article with At the Forefront ladies, and I was very curious to hear their voices. Obviously, she's coming from a very westernized or American perspective on what this whole role of a diversity inclusion officer is and what their agenda is. So I just was, curious about what your thoughts are. What did you think, Esther?
Reading about it, and Nadia's sentiments are so profound, but bringing it back to Kenya in terms of how we work, it's really not about racism, but the different isms that are there. So for Kenya, the issue about tribalism comes in, the issue about gender inequality comes in, the issue about sexism that comes in. So you find that then within a space where all of you work, you find that then even the desegregation and the non-inclusion of the different types of women, the groups of women, for example, women with disabilities, and there's women with different sexual orientation, young women from the rural area. So there's no that conscious effort in ensuring that there's that inclusion and diversity within the space. And even the thought of hiring an inclusion and diversity manager or officer, it doesn't happen here because there's that idea and notion and maybe a stereotype that we don't need it. But it's needed because then if we have such a person who is ingrained within the organization or the movement, then we are consciously able to think about what does inclusion and diversity really mean in the Kenyan setting?
Right.
And how can we ensure our programs or how we work, they're inclusive of the different groups of women, the minority, or how do we then ensure, even there's nothing like tribalism, because you find that in different offices, if maybe the manager is from one tribe, they hire people from the same tribe, and somehow people speak their mother tongue in the office. So there's no that conscious effort or someone to even point it out or even call it out. Right. So yes, it happens in Kenya, the lack of inclusion and diversity, but it's really different because it's not really purely racism. But yes, it's the different biases, tribalism, sexism, then an inclusion of the different categories of women. And I saw that it was really interesting because as much as it happens in America, it still happens here, but in a different way.
Right. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I think for myself, living and working here in Kenya, I definitely can feel a bit of the inclusion, like, oh, we're so happy that you're here, you're West African, but you're American. We might not understand that, but we welcome you, where other groups might be like, you know what, there's a Muzungu in our midst. And, I think for me, that's pretty shocking because I see myself as a returnee on this continent. And, so I think, what does it mean for all the other Africans that are living in the Kenyan space, or if Kenyans were living somewhere else in Africa and sort of being tagged as the foreigners that are, and it comes with a level of privilege when you call someone a Muzungu. I mean, it basically means like a white person or someone who's not from here, who comes from means. And so I think, in terms of looking at what does exclusion mean in the African context, it's a bit more nuanced. What do you think, Hilda? I mean, because you're a returnee. I mean, you've spent many years in the UK and then coming back here to Kenya. Yeah.
So I have worked in the UK for about 8 years. And of course, what Owusu talks about in this article applied to me at least for the time I worked in the UK, because in a lot of places I worked, of course, there was that need for diversity. And oftentimes, even talking to other women of color within the UK workspaces, there's all the discussion around discrimination. But now I'm back on the continent. I don't face the same challenges I faced when I was in the UK. I work in a setup where it's predominantly everybody's almost African. I work in a Kenyan organization that works to uplift the health of Kenyans. and everybody is African. So I don't face the same challenges that I perhaps face when I'm in the UK. However, I would like to agree with Esther because there are many other isms that are an issue, and they are an issue of discrimination when you're on the continent. And it's not just about Kenya alone. One critical factor, of course, is gender inequality. And even though Kenya has made some efforts to try and bridge the gap between inclusion of both men and women in different sectors, workplaces, schooling, or institutions of learning, we are still not there yet. For instance, in our 2010 new constitution, there is a requirement that we don't need to have more than two-thirds of one gender represented in one institution, for instance, in governance, say in parliament or in political arena. But then this law has really not been passed. It's been about 10 years now. There's always the frustration when it gets to the National Assembly. It's not passed into law. It's not actionable. And the other thing, when you're talking about crabs in a barrel, I think about women in this space, and sometimes we at the forefront, we are trying to uplift all the women and make sure we move together, and we are uplifted in different spheres. But you can find sometimes in the workplace women don't support each other. It's often said in Kenya that women are an enemy of each other. Such that when a woman tries to stand for a parliamentary position, it is said that it's fellow women who bring her down. So it is some such things that make us think that it's also important to think about diversity, but also most importantly, how do we support each other, lift each other up as African women, which I think is critical, really.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So Alice, what's your take? I mean, you have a very interesting background. Alice and I actually grew up together. We've known each other since we were children, and we both self-identify very differently. Actually, I just started calling myself American in my 20s after volunteering and living in Dakar, Senegal. Then I was like, oh, maybe I'm American. But before then, I was always an African immigrant living in the US, fighting for my green card. Not feeling like I was American, but Alice is very different. She's like, I'm Zambian, even though, whatever.
So for me, with my background experience in international developments, I have also those experiences that Esther and Hilda have touched on in regards to working in, predominantly, or not even predominantly, like all African work environments. And then there's also those experiences that I've had on the continent working with, even if it's predominantly African, but there are maybe Westerners who are based here, or, you're interacting with the global office over there, and those experiences. And I think what for me was this article was really fascinating, very interesting on many levels. And I agree with everything Hilda and Esther have said. So I want to add something new to the conversation. What stood out for me a lot was this whole, she's sharing how when somebody is facing these microaggressions at work and they want to raise it to a white person who they're working with or somebody else in the space, and they're not being, and think about some experiences that I've had where there were white Americans who came, and it was this whole white savior complex, and we're here to save the poor Black children, and it was the program that they were developing was helpful. It was, there was need for it. But you could tell in the words that she used, in the words that they used to even describe their work and the way they talked about their work and what they were doing, there was very much, we're here to save the poor Black children. And I struggled trying to, find the words to articulate to her how this is offensive. And I tried on several occasions to do so. And then I ended up as well asking my white husband, I was like, maybe this needs to be a white to white conversation. Can you, maybe she can't see it from me. Maybe it's maybe there's a block because when she's looking at me having this conversation. And he tried, but he also kind of just like, hands up. So just this question of like, some people can be blocked to these types to being open to a conversation that might make them feel bad or feel difficult. So I thought that was one thing that was particularly interesting. And then also where, if you are in these spaces, that for there to actually be change, there has to be senior level, or there has to be real interest in changing the culture of an organization or a company from the top. Otherwise, you're really fighting a long battle.
Yeah,
that's a really good point. I think that sometimes it can be hurtful to be around people that you perceive as your own, and they don't perceive you that way, or they overvalue those white saviors that come in your space and devalue you. So in some ways, I remember at one point I was working on an HIV/AIDS, organization, in Cameroon, and I noticed that the Cameroonian men, they were medical doctors, they actually overvalued administrative, young, just starting out their career women from Washington, D.C., and I was based in D.C. at the time. They would respond actively to their emails. They would participate in their meetings. And these young girls they had no attachment to the continent whatsoever. They weren't on their level technically, but these men had such a high level of respect and regard for them. However, myself, who's just, a relatively mid-career professional, I had a technical role, they really just were like, no, we don't need to listen to Evelyn. We don't need to respond to her. We don't need to be participatory or even be respectful. And I think that at times we're all dragging ourselves down when we treat ourselves that way, because it shows that we don't actually value ourselves. And while we see other groups that are absolutely seeing themselves, uplifting themselves, and then we wonder, why is it that there's, certain homogeneous leadership of organizations or boards, and, we can't seem to get there ourselves. So especially in a global setting. So I would say that's really my perspective on the crabs in the barrel mentality, and I've definitely experienced it with men and women. And I think the answer is really in terms of us having a unison in our voice and saying, look, we have to come together if we want to uplift ourselves. We cannot rely on external forces to continually build our capacity or give us resources when they may not even have the technical know-how. They don't even understand the geographic landscape, all the different cultural diversity. Why don't we value ourselves as Black people?
And maybe also to add in that, even when we are thinking through the programs, because it's our issues, we know our lived realities. So us coming through what we know and how we can be able to help each other makes much more sense than really listening to, allow me to say this, a white person who comes in, who has studied, the experiences, and they've done research. It's not enough. Yes, they have the know-how because they had people told the stories, but they don't know those stories because they don't live them. So being able to understand that. And then the other aspect that maybe I want to add is that you find that even, within the women's movement, there's that, can I say, unconscious bias that they don't know it. So someone doesn't feel that they are being biased already. So even us being in a space safe space where we can actually even call it out in a very respectful and safe space, that does not really look like attacking each other, but us learning from that experience and, understanding and say, okay, fine, it was an unconscious thing that happened. Now I've opened my eyes and I'll start treating this other person better. So at times I also feel like people don't know. But how receptive is that for those women to actually just, feel safe? And I think that's why at the forefront is very important, because we co-create those safe spaces where we can have the conversation that nobody wants to talk about.
Exactly.
The different classes of women that we have. We find that even when all of you are educated, the fact that the other person is more educated brings in another dynamic.
Exactly.
The fact that the other person has lived somewhere else bring another dynamic. So being in a space where we all accept our privilege, understand where we're coming from, but we saw each other as one. That's the only way we can move forward.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I want to agree with all of that, particularly because I think what ails us and I'm going to talk about as from the continent, is a colonialism of the mind. And so it's very important that we are able to work on decolonizing our minds, because a lot of the things we suffer, those little bits of discrimination against each other, looking at each other different, or looking at somebody who's has another lived experience as different or better or maybe not as good as you, is really that perception that there must be classes of people, and we have to shed that mentality. So one great thing, of course, at the forefront is that these conversations we are having are critical, are great, because as a returnee, and it is very interesting when you leave and you come back, you look at things very differently because you've had another experience. So you're able to look at things in a different kind of perspective. There's a fixation that if you're from outside, you're somehow better, or you have, you can add better value than anybody else. Yet, when we sit on the table as women, regardless of where you've come from or regardless of your experiences, there's something you can always bring to the table. So one of the critical things I think for us is to have as much conversation with each other, and encourage African women to talk about these things and to realize that we are all the same. We are all equal. We don't need to discriminate against each other. So for me, I think it's decolonizing the mind is one critical thing. And that's, I hope, is what we can achieve with other forefront.
I think that, Alex, I'm sorry, Alice, go ahead.
I was just going to add, kind of jumping into this decolonization, kind of moving forward, this concept and next steps is like, one of the things I've been fortunate to have African female directors and bosses who have been, powerhouses, and who really, they are mentors, and they are focused on particularly other African Black women and focusing on bringing them up as well. And then I've also had the complete opposite experience also with African directors and female bosses. And, we've had this conversation of, even at least of mentorship, and how there can be somebody who has kind of made it to a level where they are in a position to bring along others or support others in that space. But are they psychologically in a place where they can be a mentor to you and provide, and give you that space to grow and thrive and support you in that? And maybe they themselves are suffering with their own history and their own background that took them to get to that place, that they don't have that energy or that space. And so, those would be amazing conversations as well to have with, people in those spaces, to be like, how do you mentor? Is it hard? And why is it hard? And unpacking that as well. But I do think having, for us to kind of stand up for ourselves as well. And in this international development space where there's donor funding, and donor funding largely comes from the West, and it's like, oh, we have to do what you say. I've had experiences where there's like, oh, even as much as people are feeling lots of, gender inequality, and racial aggressions, they're still like, no, this funding is here, so we have to do this way. But I've also had experiences where others have been like, no, it's not worth it. So I think the more we can even just stand up for ourselves and say, it's not worth it. Funding will come from other sources. But I don't think we have enough of those voices saying it's no, saying no to those types of allegiances if it's going to come with prejudices.
Yeah. That's a really great point. So I think we're going to just wrap up this segment and say that we're so happy that you decided to join us for this critical conversation. And at the forefront, we will continue this series for the rest of the year. Our next session will actually focus on feminism. And as Black women, as Africans, do we subscribe to this whole global movement of feminism? What do we think about African feminism? Because there's a lot of buzz, especially in March, International Women's Day, and it's Women's Month coming up. So please do join us for our next critical conversation.